So our first talk is by Kevin Whelan, a native of County Wexford, and he works with the University of Notre Dame. He has authored or edited 20 books and more than 100 articles, and he has lectured on Irish topics in 14 countries. Among his books are the best-selling Atlas of the Irish Rural Landscape, second edition, 2011. I will now hand over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Paul. Delighted to be here, though I do have to say it's somewhat false pretenses because I'm not a botanist, but I do, like many people, love flowers and plants. My background is in geography, especially historical geography, which is about the evolution of what we would call the cultural landscape. That is not just the natural landscape, but the landscape as it's been influenced by human culture over a very long period. And of course, plants are an essential feature of that. So you can forgive me my lack of botanical knowledge, but perhaps share my enthusiasm for understanding more about these wonderful things in our lives. We all have things we always wanted to kind of see, a bucket list of plants or whatever, you know. I suppose everybody gets interested in something that's slightly obsessive. For me, it was this guy, the bee orchid. I love the burn. Been going down there really for 4 decades. Wanted always to see the bee orchid, and then about 2 years ago, I nearly stood on the damn, I was going to say the damn thing, but that wouldn't be the right word, would it? But I mean, how beautiful is that? The mimicry of the orchid, and what a wonderful thing it is to kind of see. But at the same time, I'll take the next one there, Robert, we'll put through. Plants play an essential part in people's lives. And I suppose if there's one thing I wanted to share this morning, it's that we can have a scientific discussion about plants, and we do need to know all of that. But in the end, there's also a very important other layer, which is what do the plants have as a meaning in people's lives? In Ireland, this is a very important one. This is what botanists would call Creighton grass or Brisa media. It's a perennial grass, but in Ireland, it's called Anfair Gurta, which means the hungry grass. It has quivering, as we can't see it really in the photograph, but it's quivering little triangular panicles of flowers which tremble and shiver in the wind. And believe me, Ireland is a windy country, so plenty of shivering going on. But in the Irish tradition, that plant grows where somebody died during our Great Famine, when over 1 million people died. So the idea there is, and that also then that if you set foot on that plant, you yourself will be stricken by hunger pangs. And it's a metaphor, of course, but it's an empathetic understanding of the relationship between the past and present. So here's this grass, which has a huge signature or imprint in terms of ordinary life, and which fit into, as it were, a cultural narrative as well as a scientific or biological narrative of plants. And I think that's really important, but it's often where other people who may not be botanists per se, but it's where they intersect in a very meaningful way with plants. In the same way, my wife always complains to me that, you know, you're interested in rare plants and you're interested in unusual kind of things, but what about the common ordinary things? And here's probably one of the most common of all, the dandelion. I always explain to my kids that it comes from the French, as you know, Dandelion, because the shape of the leaves are similar to that of the lion, obviously. And maybe we'd be more interested in some of the rare ones, like the turlock dandelion that grows in the burn, the Taraxum palustre. But in some ways, if the dandelion was not such a common thing, and if we didn't treat it as a weed, if we never saw the dandelion and somebody introduced us to the leaf or the seeds of the dandelion, we would be absolutely thrilled and say, oh my God, this is an absolute masterpiece of natural engineering. And then, of course, as we all know, the way that those seeds become airborne and spread the dandelion. It's a remarkable kind of thing, but it's very ordinariness, if I might use that word, makes us in some respects blind to it. And of course, we might also say, back to the previous one there, you know, that this is what somebody like William Shakespeare had in mind when he wrote those famous lines, golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. A nod towards our English participants today, that in the Warwickshire dialect, apparently, Golden lads was the name for the dandelion when it was in flower, and chimney sweepers, because it looked like a chimney sweeper's brush. Chimney sweepers was what people called the seed head of the dandelion. And of course, we all, as children, blew on these. But it's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? If you think of it that way, that this is about a plant. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. I want to kind of give an Irish shout out now. I'm a big fan of our game, hurling, which is unquestionably the oldest, the fastest, and the best field sport in the world. The ball in Irish is called Leeroy, and Leeroy is the Irish word for a ball. It's only recently that I discovered that, in fact, the word Leeroy originally applied to this, the seed head of the thistle, which has that very rounded kind of shape. So here is something where, again, shows observation. That when people originally applied the word to the seed head of the thistle and then applied it later to the hurling ball, or a slitter, as we call it. So again, my point here is the intersection between plants and culture, and how a deeper understanding of plants can actually enhance a cultural understanding as well. So here we switch to the Irish landscape. This is taken from Sweden and Mon. This is what the French would call a bocage landscape. Pardon my execrable French, bocage, B-O-C-A-G-E. It means a landscape like this, which is of course characteristic of large parts of Ireland and England as well. And that is divided up into fields with very significant passages of hedgerows. And these hedgerows, or field boundaries, or ditches, as we call them in the rural Wexford of my youth, these form an incredible pattern of linear kind of connection within the landscape. This is how birds and animals navigate through the landscape, but this is also how plants and other things spread. And of course, those hedges themselves have a huge botanical history kind of embedded in them. So, and as you head to the west of Ireland, then you get this other remarkable thing, the incredible networks of Irish stone walls, about 600,000 linear kilometers. We're in the EU, so I'll use the kilometers. 600,000 kilometers of these stone walls. This is a handcrafted landscape, but again, hugely important botanically, or perhaps, I don't know whether you guys include algae and lichens, but these walls are absolutely festooned with those lichens and algae. The lichens, very sensitive, so a very important marker of the air quality. But again, the point I'm making is, in Ireland, when you start looking at nature or plants or whatever, there's always this dialogue of reciprocity, or va-et-vient, as the French would say, coming and going between the natural landscape and the other one. Now, here's really where Ireland gets, I think, significant on the botanical scale. Most of what we have is also elsewhere. But what we do have in Ireland is a rather unusual climate, especially in the southwest of the country. And that is that we have a warm, moist climate with lots and lots of rain. It's what we're most associated with. And the thing about that then is our kind of Irish rainforest, if we might use that term, is not in the trees. It's actually in the incredible profusion of lichens and bryophytes and ferns and other shade-loving, damp-loving plants, which literally can festoon mile after mile of the landscape. This is in the woods of Killarney. And of course, next one there, yes, of course, that also leads to these powerful conditions for the growth of ferns. During the week there in the Chelsea Flower Garden, one of the gold medals went to an Irish designer using ferns actually from here. This is my favorite spot in Ireland for plants. This is Dandelion. It's just outside Kenmare in Kerry. And Dandelion has these incredible ferns, an incredible growth of ferns, tree-high ferns where you're looking up at them. And again, like it's always kind of dripping. So it's a wet, rainforesty kind of thing. Understandable, because if you look at the rain map for Ireland, you can see that down there in Kerry, down the very bottom left-hand corner there, has the heaviest rain in Ireland, and has like over 250 rain days in the year. Doesn't mean it rains all the time, but there's always a little bit of rain. But that creates this incredibly profuse plant growth in with a mixture too, as botanists would say, of the Mediterranean stuff that will grow in warm weather, but also then with this unusual Arctic kind of plants, more visible up in the Burren, but an unusual combination of Mediterranean plants which tend to like warm and Arctic plants which tend to like open landscapes, or at least colder landscapes. But the two of them found in startling juxtaposition often in Ireland. It's not there's anything too unique about it, but it's the combinations that make Ireland special. Here's one of the ones that everybody knows about who likes Irish plants. This is the maidenhair fern. Enough said about where the name came from, but in the Latin it's adiantum, and the Greek word adiantos, and you're all good Greek scholars like Boris Johnson, means unwetted, because the fronds of the adiatum have the ability, of the maidenhair fern, have an immense ability to repel water without themselves becoming wet. And my point about this, the reason really why I wanted to talk about it was not the Greek name, but the Irish name. The Irish name is Custuvok, or Custuach, and that means black-footed. And why they describe the maidenhair fern as black-footed, it's because it has a very, very striking black stalk, off which these beautiful, delicate green leaves then radiate. So it showed how closely the Irish were looking at it, that they called it Custuach. This, by the way, is an illustration from Moore's wonderful book about ferns, with its wonderful illustrations published back in 1851. And if you want to see this plant in profusion, I suggest you look at my next spot here. This is, again, the Irish thing. Now, you have to kind of stand back a little bit from the illustration, but this is in the Burren. This is the famous blackhead. If you come around from Ballybonan, heading out west, you come to this thing just about a quarter of a mile from what is now Blackhead. But this was the original Blackhead. If you look, you can see the two eye sockets. You can see down below the mount. Originally, the water poured out of the mount. It must have been a very striking thing. As always in a karst landscape like this, the water has now gone deeper, but you can still see the blackhead because it's stained with manganese. But my point about this is, if you want to see the maidenhair fern in its glory, it grows magnificently just in those shaded areas there. But again, the point being the relationship between one thing and the other. I'm now going to show you an illustration. This is of oak gods, created by those wasps, which attack the leaves of the oak, and which then create these oak galls. Now, why do I show you that? Because out of the oak galls come the blackest and the densest ink that can be made. And how do we know that? We know that because in 2009, a couple of turf cutters in Faddenmore in County Tipperary dug up a manuscript, which looked like a kind of a soggy lasagna. And when it was restored by my friend John Gillis, they were able to discover, although it had been over a millennium in the bog, they were able to read the damn thing, and they were also able to actually recover individual letters where the paint, the ink, the black ink made from the oak galls had survived for thousands of years in the anaerobic conditions of the bog. Now, who the hell first understood or discovered that you could make such a permanent, dark and magnificent ink from the oak galls? All of us know the Book of Kells, but the black in the Book of Kells was generated from here. So again, knowledge of plants, interaction with plants, and as it were, experimentation with plants must have been there all the time. In the same way, all my hipstery friends love this stuff now. This is sea kale. This is down in close enough to where Paul lives in County Wexford. This is on the beach at St. Margaret's. And in 1757, an estate 1759, an estate survey there talked about the plants which grew along the sea in these kind of stony storm beaches which prevail there. It says asparagus grows naturally in the sandbanks, and beach kale, so much prized by persons of distinction, also grows in plenty on the seashore, common to all. We're now all about him food, foraging and whatever, but this sea kale, which resists salt, but which grows, as I said, well on storm beaches, is now much in demand by very fancy restaurants. But already back in 1759, people knew that this was edible and tasty. In the same way, this is my next slide is from Tintern Abbey, Tintern Minor, Tintern Major is over in Wales. But what I want to show you is if you walk through Tintern, as I often do, it is incredibly pungent with garlic. And at certain times of the year, when it flowers, there's almost an overwhelming smell of it, right? And of course, my point here is where did that come from? And the garlic originally came because the monks, in this case, the Cistercians, brought it in with them. It was the Benedictines who pioneered herb gardens across Europe, and the Cistercians brought it with them here in the 12th century. There's a wonderful French manual of herbs in 1393. It details how rosemary cuttings were packed for export from France to Ireland, wrapped in wax cloth, sealed, smeared with honey all over, and then dipped in flour. And that was the way they were able to transplant these herbs from their native habitats across large parts of Europe. And we know that in the Irish monasteries, there were 3 types of garden: vegetable gardens, spice gardens, medicinal gardens. And recorded herbs that we know grew there include hives, wild garlic, parsnip, kale, apples, flax, and also flowers like the Irish rose and lilies, which had medicinal purposes. So there's a huge list, and I'm not going to give it to you here, but it's known, huge list of plants which had medicinal properties, which were grown around these locations. And the Irish knew about these, and they had their own herbals, and there's an early one from 1525, which lists over 490 herbs and their medicinal properties. So people were very aware of plants, and they were very aware of what uses they had, and it's very likely that there are many cures or many clues as to what we might do in terms of synthetic medicines if we studied more carefully the knowledge of these people. But my point about that also is, I presume most of you this morning have an interest in botany. My point would be that a more detailed study of the areas around these monastic sites often reveals what botanists call archaeophytes. That is, plants which are known to have existed in the country before 1500. So at Tintern Abbey, where I am here, when they reviewed what was in the latrines, the jacks, the toilets, they discovered seeds from blackberries, raspberries, wild strawberries, figs, prunes, sloes, haws, apples, and pears. And it also, elsewhere in Ireland, we see things which came from very far away already in the medieval period. Rhubarb from Tibet, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves and camphor from Indonesia. So again, in these places like the monasteries, some later on in the big houses or domains, you get this incredible infusion of exotic plants as well. So, you know, the plants like horseradish, Alexander's, the Alostrum family, and typical archaeophytes, old plants include white dead nettle, the plum, the mallow. And these species indicate that these places had very strong medieval settlement and cultivation patterns, but they still survive in the modern landscape. In the same way, I'll take the next one here, the Irish themselves, and we know this from the Irish annals, which are extremely good, they always recorded in the Irish annals when there was a strong massed harvest, in other words, of acorns, but equally of hazelnuts. Why were hazelnuts, the corylus, why was that so important? Because the hazel, the common elder, and the wild strawberry, which were pretty ubiquitous in Ireland, in Irish, the hazelnut was called clodagh. And why were those 3 important? Why was it called the Irish nut? It's because it was a concentrated foodstuff for both human and animal consumption. We all know that the squirrels will gather these to get them through the winter, which humans did so as well back in the old days. All 3 are also easily stored as jams or preserves for the winter months. And all 3, as we now know, are very valuable sources of oils and vitamins. And the wild strawberry gives you that incredible kind of sweetness, which in Ireland, as elsewhere, was only really provided by honey until the slave sugar of the 17th century began to arrive on our shores. So the essential sweetness was provided there as well. But again, I just want to kind of point out these kind of simple things, the hazelnut and the acorn. This is from the next one there, Robert. The medieval manuscripts, which show you here the pigs feeding on the acorn. Again, agriculture depended on that as well. And that also intersected in the next one there, Robert, with these amazing trees that you can get in Ireland. This is one of my favorite ones. I'm proud of that photograph too. I took it on my phone, but I think it's good. This is the yew tree, the Fuchsia, and this is in Muckers Abbey, just on the shores of the lakes of Killarney. Now look at how old that tree is. It's grown in the cloister. It's right through the whole building. And as you walk through the 3 or 4 stories of the building, which still survive, you're catching glimpses of this magnificent yew tree, which was also commented on by every visitor to Killarney once its tourist industry started back in 1750. The yew tree is ancient in Ireland. Well, we are also part of the famous Columbian exchange, the interplay of plants introduced by the Atlantic. Believe it or believe it not, this is a photograph which sold for $1 million in 2017. It's by an Irish photographer, and good luck to him, called Kevin Whelan, sold in New York for $1 million. The potato is the miracle crop in Ireland, but it's part of the Columbian exchange. Is there anything more associated with Ireland other than rain, Guinness, red hair? But if you ask people to name Irish features, the potato would definitely feature in the top 5. And yet it is, in some ways, an invasive species in Ireland, and incredibly successful because its natural home, the Toluca Valley in Mexico, is high in the Andes, and the potato can thrive in mist and grey kind of weather. So again, the interplay and the understanding those kind of interactions, that the potato is not a symbol of poverty or backwardness in Ireland, it's actually a symbol of Ireland being involved into the Atlantic economy and the Columbian exchange. Next one, yes, but the Irish also brought in, you won't be able to read this, but I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested. But this is the earliest catalogue of garden seeds and flower roots that I've been able to discover. This is from 1705, and what it is an incredibly detailed listing of plants and seeds that you could grow in Ireland, but they're now coming from all over the world. And of course, the British Empire, as it's always kind of said as it spread, that's a little passive, as the British Empire aggressively imposed itself across the globe as part of the loot, and the word loot is the Hindi word L-U-T, loot, the first word from Hindi that enters the English language, plunder, but part of that was bringing back botanical specimens and growing them. And of course, that then enters into the Irish domains. This is 1680, map of Carton in Kildare. I know it'd be a bit hard to see, but up in the left-hand corner there, you have the asparagus garden. Asparagus was an important elite food. You have the cherry garden, the plum garden, and so on. But now these manicured or landscape gardens in the early phases, very geometrical like this. Here's Holt from 1740. This painting sold last week from the original house, which is still there, Holt, just north of Dublin. But again, with these very formal gardens and parterres and an emphasis on symmetry and whatever, which didn't really suit the Irish landscape. This came from flat areas like the Netherlands, but what really suited Ireland very well was a more natural landscape, and as in this photograph of, this is the Moss House down on the right there, and this is on the slopes of the Slaney at what used to be Newtown Barry, now called Bunclody and Wexford. But the Irish landscape naturally lent itself to the more romantic style associated with Capability Brown and others, because the Irish landscape was naturally variegated, loads of water, loads of streams, no problem putting in little waterfalls. You have all these hills and hollows and whatever. So the Irish landscape took to the romantic style in landscaping, like, can I say it, a duck to water. And then the magnificent landscape gardens of Ireland are all in this style. Okay, but that also involved, next one there, in what we would now call invasive plants. This is one that most people love and that I hate. This is the rhododendron, because it's a beautiful strangler, isn't it? It's a wonderful plant in its own native habitat, but in Ireland it's wreaking havoc with our ancient woodlands, especially the oak woodlands. My university, Notre Dame, as we call it, has a link, strong link with Kylemore Abbey in Connemara, and the oak woods behind that on the north-facing slopes, which are primeval woodland, that's never been cut, remarkably rich botanically, but they're now absolutely being smothered by the rhododendron. And of course, in Ireland, we have many other invasive species, the Gunneria or the Gunnera tinctoria, which dominates large parts of the West of Ireland now. And the next one here, this is the Himalayan balsam, which is now spreading with such rapidity in Ireland, you wouldn't believe it. If you walk from St. Mullins to Graignamanagh, which is 4 miles, the whole bank of the river there is festooned in the balsam. Now, again, the right balance, the correct balance between native plants and foreign, as it were, or invasive plants. And I hear it in my own language. When we start talking about these, it's kind of like there's almost a racism around language that we don't like the invasives. But the Irish are also good at adopting them. I said already about the potato. This is another invasive species in Ireland, really. The Fuchsia, which began as a garden plant, but really likes, especially the west coast of Ireland, that mild, moist climate I was talking about. And we know that this was absorbed into the local culture because the beautiful name for the fuchsia in the Irish language is Jore Day. And that means God's teardrops. God's teardrops. So again, that ability to connect with plants and to bring them into people's spirituality or people's sense of themselves has always been there in Ireland as well. I also want to kind of point out that the next one there, Robert, that over a very long period, especially from the early 18th century onward, Ireland begins to produce, shall we say, the beginnings of scientific kind of botany, much of it concerned with cataloguing the plants initially, but then also with displaying them. And I love this book. It's Edward Donovan, An Epitome of the Natural History of the Insects of China. He'd never been there, but it was published in London in 1798. Got lots of his specimens from the Belfast man, George McCartney, Britain's first envoy to China. And what is striking in his photographs, and here he's shown the butterflies, is he was also very keen to show what botany connected with the plants. So he was the first guy to show insect in, as it were, their natural and plant-based habitats. So again, you gotta love this guy. He ended up going broke because he spent too much money on producing these magnificent books and illustrations and ended up destitute. His passion, as it were, for plants made him destitute. In the same way, we have many, from the late 18th century on, we have many, what used to be called natural scientists. This is John Templeton. This is something which is now, I think, called after him. This is the broom rake, which he was the first to discover in Ireland. And this is his wonderful drawings. The drawings of the Irish plants by him are in the Ulster Museum, and they're a marvelous set of illustrations. He was also, as with many scientists, he was also early scientists. He was also something of a polymath. So he drew here the famous Bunán Bui, as it's called in Irish, the Bitran. There's a famous poem in Irish called on Bunán Bui, about the drunkard seeing the dead Bitran on the road and kind of seeing his own fate in that. A wonderful poem in Irish. But the Bunán Bui, the Bitran, with its very distinctive and plaintive cry, which is a native creature of the Irish bogs. What I'm trying to say is people understood an experiential aspect of the plants, not just the taxonomy, or not just the scientific aspect, but understanding how plants fitted into a wider environment and how all of this, the plants, the birds, the animals, the humans, agriculture, how all of this fitted into what we might now call an ecosystem. So Templeton was early in terms of understanding all that. And now I'm coming towards an end, not to overstretch my time. But again, these wonderful things that we have in Ireland, as everywhere else has, as I said earlier too. But these are ours. This is in Erris. It's not really a true wilderness, but it's probably the wildest place you can go in Ireland is the Erris Bogs in Northwest Mayo. And it's festooned with these beautiful, what I call bog ballerinas. They look like tutus, floating in the breeze. But again, just such a beautiful plant, able to thrive in what otherwise might seem a rather arid environment, and which contributes so much. There's so many poems about these things because they're just naturally beautiful, evocative, and touch a human heart or anybody with any kind of sensibility at all. Okay, last few. The tradition, you see, this is what I like. This is what I call the dappled light of Ireland. The old Irish woodlands were deciduous, and deciduous woods allow the light to filter down to the floor of the forest. And then you get, at different times of the year, you get these magnificent blooms. Here's the bluebells. This is Abbeyleix in the Irish Midlands, photographed by the best Irish landscape photographer, Owen Kavanagh. But again, the colors of that, the feel of that, the light there, that's the Irish magic, the filtering of the light. Because we have one of the most mobile skies in the world above us, and then with these trees filtering it down, it can be magical. I was over in Glendalough last week, and just the colors and the changing mood and the light, and that's one of the brilliant things in Ireland. You can go to, and indeed in Britain, which shares a lot of our climate, maybe we have it in more extremes. But the point I'm making here is no matter how many times you go to the same place, it's never the same, because the light changes. It's not like Greece or California or somewhere with guaranteed blue sky, which gets hideously boring after about 10 days. And the fickleness and variety of the Irish light is really a part of the kind of magic. Okay, 3 more. This is the last 3. This is from the Flaggy Shore, scene of a famous poem by Seamus Heaney. But what I want to kind of point out here is the way the poppies will grow on these kind of broken ground. And of course, as in England, where the poppy became a symbol of deaths during the First World War and the Second World War, because poppies, as you know, have this amazing ability to reseed even after the seed have been in the ground for centuries, maybe even millennia. The poppy seed is incredibly resilient. The poppy will then pop up when the ground is broken, as it is in battles with horses and later on with tanks and whatever. So again, you know, even in something which everybody knows about, and which is often quite controversial in our country, the poppy, but at the same time, it is associated with, say, a famous battle site in Wexford, Vinegar Hill, the climactic battle of 1798. The year afterwards, the whole hill at Vinegar Hill in 1799, the whole hillside turned red with poppies. And of course, it became a symbol. The hillside flushed, so in our broken way. Next one there, Robert. This is the same thing here. This is Templeton in the Hook. And again, there you can see just there was a little bit of a cleanup done on it, but not too intrusive. And this year, all this stuff, it's not rewilding, all this stuff just grew where the ground had been cleared off a little bit. So again, the incredible ability of nature to regenerate itself. And my last one, this is a slide I robbed from our host this morning, Paul. This is the allium moly, or the yellow garlic. The reason why I pointed out is because I must have passed that 1,000 times on my way to school. It's literally 300 yards away from the house I was born and reared in. I never saw it. But Paul, with his botanist eyes, saw it. And that's what we're looking for, isn't it? The eye, but also the connection. And the fact now that the next time I go to Donegal, I'll be keeping my eye out for this one, the allium moly, or yellow garlic. Okay, thanks very much, folks.